I'd just like to welcome you and ask you to state your name and your affiliation for the podcast.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. My name is Fred McKinney, and I wear several hats, but the primary hat that I'm wearing right now is I'm the Carlton Highsmith Chair for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Quinnipiac University and the Director of the People's United Bank Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, also at Quinnipiac University. In addition to that, though, I am a founder of a consulting company called BJM Solutions. And at BJM Solutions, one of the things that we do is we work on minority business development and corporate supplier diversity. And we have some other projects that we work on using our economic talent. Right now, for instance, we're doing a project with the Access Health Connecticut organization, which is the Obamacare organization for Connecticut. And we just completed a study for them looking at health disparities in Black and Brown communities in the state of Connecticut.
Well, welcome. We're so pleased to have you joining us today. I just wanted to start by going back to the beginning of your work in this area. You received a BA in economics from UCLA and a PhD in economics from Yale Graduate School. And during this time, you were right away, it seems like, from your CV, thinking about the policy implications of some of this work. You spent some summers at RAND. You were on the Council of Economic Advisors. What were some of the key questions then that were animating the work that you were doing?
Well, there were some important dates in that bio. One was my time at UCLA. And so while I was a student at UCLA, I worked for all 4 years at UCLA. All 4 years I worked for the Vice Chancellor, CZ Wilson, who was a mentor and a lifelong friend. And CZ was also at that time, I'm talking about 1972 to 1976 is when I was at UCLA. CZ was the highest ranking African-American in the University of California system at that time, as the vice chancellor at UCLA. He was also an economist. And so he held a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois and had been very active in among the first real group of Black economists that were trained at predominantly white institutions. And so he was he had a fellow student and colleague by the name of Marcus Alexis. And so they were colleagues, and Marcus went on to become the dean of the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern. He has since passed, but Marcus and CZ were leaders in a movement to really get organized around Black economic issues, not just an organization for Black economists, but an organization that looked at Black issues in economics. And so they were the founders of the National Economic Association, which in 2019 celebrated its 50th anniversary. And I attended that, and CZ was honored along with several of the other founders that are still with us. And so that organization was one of the things that CZ had me working on as an undergraduate. And so UCLA hosted a conference, one of the early conferences of what was called the National Economic Association. So it was a part of the American Economic Association, which was the main body of economists. And so this was like an interest group within the American Economic Association. So CZ and UCLA hosted an event along with another. At that time, he was still a graduate student, but he had been hired by UCLA. He is still at UCLA, Alfred Osborne, and I don't know if you know that name, but Al was the associate dean of the Anderson School until he just recently left the Anderson School deanship. And so Al was a young guy. I was an undergraduate. Al was a graduate student who had just been hired as a young assistant professor at Anderson. Wasn't even called Anderson back then. It was this UCLA School of Management. And so we worked on organizing this conference, which was, really exciting stuff for me as an undergraduate, to have all these folks come in to campus and talking about Black community development. And I think it's also important to understand the context, the time. UCLA was in 1972, 73, was a hotbed of activism of all kinds. So the Black Panthers had been very active on campus in the late 60s and early 70s, to the extent that there had been a shooting on campus, and there were several people killed, including 2 Panthers. There was a UCLA student who had been arrested and for the murder of a cop, and he was arrested and convicted and sent to San Quentin. So he was a UCLA student. He was president of the Black Student Union. I became president of the Black Student Union my senior year, so this history was really familiar and close. And one of the things we did at the Black Student Union is we went up to San Quentin to visit with the Panther who had been arrested. So this was a really interesting time. And so to have professional economists come to campus to talk about really the same issues that the Black Panther Party was talking about, the underdevelopment of communities throughout the country. And there were just, so many similarities that, economists are always looking for, trying to understand large social forces that are leading to outcomes, whether it be poverty or hunger or discrimination. What are the forces that are leading to that? And so those were the things that the National Economic Association, that's what they were thinking about in the late 60s and early 70s. And they actually created a journal, and that came out of that work. And I worked on some of those early journals. It was called the Review of Black Political Economy. And so that came out of that work with the National Economic Association. So I would say that, I was involved pretty early on, and CZ was a mentor who basically told me I didn't want to be a dentist. What would I want to be spending the rest of my professional life looking in somebody's mouth? And so he said, you should become an economist. So drop all that dental stuff and start taking some math and some social science courses. And I actually enjoyed the switch from becoming a dental major to an economics major.
So at the time, there are a lot of policy at the federal level coming out to try to address these issues around economic development, underdevelopment, active divestment, under investment. And I was looking at the Journal of the Black Political Economy, and I saw some early publications you had there where you were looking at questions of race and class in occupation distribution, and also how things like federal job training dollars were affecting mobility on behalf of Black community in particular.
Yeah, I mean, those were some writings I had many decades ago. But yeah, this was still in the late 70s, or even mid to late 70s. We were still, within a decade of the real war on poverty from the Johnson administration in the mid to late 60s when those things started. We were still less than a decade away from the assassination of Martin Luther King. So we were, a decade away from the assassination of Malcolm X. So there was a lot of heady stuff going on at the federal level. And there's what's going on today in Washington, to me, is really reminiscent of what was going on in the late 60s in Washington, when Congress and the White House were thinking seriously about really aggressive interaction in markets and society to address systemic problems of race that this country has been dealing with for centuries. And so, the war on poverty created a number of interventions, including job training, in a serious way that looked at underemployment, and also just discrimination in labor markets was a big issue. Labor markets is how most people earn their income, and so those are important markets to try to understand when you're looking at issues of poverty. And again, if you look at the occupational distribution in the 60s, I mean, we talk now in today's world, we talk a lot about the ossification of society and how difficult it is to move from one level in society to the next level. It was probably harder then, particularly for Black folks who, if you were born into poverty, whether it be urban poverty or rural poverty, it was difficult to get out of that situation. And so you had Robert Kennedy, whose eyes were opened to this when he visited the Delta in Mississippi with Marion Wright Edelman, who later became a real leader in the promotion of the rights and needs of children in America. And he saw in the Delta of Mississippi poverty that he had never seen before, and a lot of Americans had just never seen before. Same time, Johnson was influenced by trips to West Virginia and seeing, massive poverty in Appalachia. And again, these images were conflicted with what we thought, or where we thought American society was in the late middle part of the 20th century. So, there was compelling evidence that we needed as a society to address poverty. And so, you had the expansion and the development of programs that dealt specifically with the manifestation of poverty, whether it be food stamps or aid to families with dependent children, job training. So all of these things became very, very important, and particularly in democratic circles. That these were problems that we needed to solve as Americans. Specifically, you look at occupational distributions in the late 60s. Most Black workers in the country were really working in the lowest occupational categories: service workers, food workers, work that required physical activity. This is before the computer age as well, for the most part. So, work was very different in the 60s and even into the 70s than it is today. And so there was a large group of American workers that worked in jobs that paid at or below the federal minimum wage. Minimum wage itself, had been around for a while, but was used during the war on poverty to actually address poverty.
So I want to move forward in time a little bit. You've had an academic career spanning Brandeis, University of Connecticut. You're now at Quinnipiac University. And at Quinnipiac, you've been doing a lot of teaching in entrepreneurship and thinking very proactively about how to create a kind of entrepreneurship ecosystem that can be catalytic both for the university community and more broadly. how did you get interested moving from labor markets to entrepreneurship?
Well, I think that goes back to even earlier than my time at UCLA. I've always been an entrepreneur, um, mainly out of necessity as a kid, growing up in Washington, D.C. Again, going back to the 60s, I had a paper route, um, as a elementary school kid. And that was a business because as a paper delivery boy back in the 60s, I mean, I delivered the now gone Washington Star, which was an evening paper. So back then, Washington had three papers, and one was an evening paper. And so I delivered that after school. But it was a business because I had to go out and collect the money, the subscriptions from the people who got the paper. I mean, they didn't mail checks to the mail back in those days. You went out and got your money in cash. And so I had to settle up with essentially my wholesaler who dropped the papers off, and I had to pay him for all of the papers that he delivered at a certain price, and I got to keep the difference, or what economists call, I was the true residual claimant. So if there was no residual, I didn't get anything. And so I had a very strong financial incentive to learn how to collect money from people who were twice my size. And but in addition to that, I cut grass, I shoveled snow, I created a racetrack for model cars that my partner and I we bought the track, we built the track, and we charged the neighborhood kids to bring their cars and run on our track because we had this whole garage to set up as a track, and so they paid us, and so we were in business for doing that. So it was always something that I was always looking for some way to make a little money to support myself and kind of stay out of trouble. So I did that, and I had businesses in college, and so I was always interested in entrepreneurship, and what went into it. And it's interesting because you learn not everybody is an entrepreneur, not everybody is comfortable being an entrepreneur. And so I always felt comfortable being an entrepreneur, and I liked being around other entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs are just very interesting people. They look at problems, and where many people who are not entrepreneurs just kind of walk away or just accept those problems. Entrepreneurs kind of look at problems and say, I wonder if I could fix that, or how would I fix that? And so that's really kind of the motivation. I just enjoy being around creative people who are trying to solve problems. And I think entrepreneurs are in that group. Now at Quinnipiac, I've been trying to really develop that, what you describe as an ecosystem on campus with the students, the staff, and the faculty, and connect that entrepreneurial spirit to the larger community around Quinnipiac. And it takes time to do that. Fortunately, many of the students at Quinnipiac, many of them are first generation students. And also many of them are coming from families where their parents own businesses. So they actually come from an entrepreneurial class. But I find one of the things that's interesting is, while entrepreneurs are great folks and they enjoy doing it, and I enjoy being around them, many of my entrepreneurs don't want their children to be entrepreneurs because they understand how hard it is. And, getting a job is much easier than being an entrepreneur. You don't have to worry about get a good job with a good company. You don't have to worry about whether the paycheck's going to arrive. If you're an entrepreneur, again, you're the residual claimant. And if there's no money there, there's no money there. So that's risky. So it's kind of like, okay, well, you want us to do what our parents don't want us to do? I said, yeah, if you do it well, you'll be glad you did it. And so you've seen it. You've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think in some respects it's more difficult, but at the same time it may be more easy because they are familiar with it. They've seen it from up close and personal. But building that ecosystem is also interesting from an institutional perspective, because while I sit in the business school, to me, entrepreneurship is something that cuts across all disciplines and all departments. And I think, my whole approach is that I need this to be something that is successful for the whole university, for students in arts and sciences, to engineering, to medicine, to law, to nursing. And so, that's been kind of the work that I've been doing to sort of build that culture on campus.
Earlier you were talking, when we were talking about labor markets and occupations and thinking back to the 1970s labor markets and some of the research you did at that time, you were talking about some of the barriers to mobility at that time for Black workers. Thinking about entrepreneurship and minority-owned businesses in particular, what have some of the challenges been for people of color going into entrepreneurship, and how far have we come on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's our American. If you look at American history in general, it's not a straight line. It may be trending up, but it's up with dips, and we could see some of those dips particularly when it comes to Black entrepreneurship and the relationship between Black business and entrepreneurs in American society. Going again, there's a history lesson here, and I almost feel like I have to kind of share that history, because I think without sharing that history, you don't really understand what's going on today and some of the problems. And so if you go back, and you can, I won't go back too far, but if you go back to the post-slavery, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, and when Northern troops Union troops were still in the South, and they ensured that Black people could vote and participate and own land and start a business and do things. And so you were beginning to see Black elected officials at the federal and the state and the local levels in the former Confederacy, and there was a reaction. And so American history is always one of action and reaction. And so the reaction to Northern troops in the former Confederacy was the KKK, and essentially their attempt to reestablish their power in these regions. And one of the things that was really at the center of this struggle was, what can and should Blacks be able to do in a society that's dominated by former Confederates? And so one of the things that Blacks were not supposed to do was to become wealthy. And they weren't supposed to hire whites. So whites couldn't work for Blacks in the post-Reconstruction South. Blacks had a very difficult time accumulating capital and generating wealth, because as they generated wealth, they had a target on their back, not just a target from a sort of a metaphorical sense, but this was a literal target on your back. And so Black entrepreneurs in the South, which was where most Blacks still lived throughout the late 19th century and through the mid 20th century and late 20th century, quite frankly, the occupations that were really most threatening to the white establishment were teachers. So they didn't, because teachers could teach people how to read, write, and figure things out for themselves. Preachers who taught that you don't have to accept this, and business leaders, Black business leaders who who said, we can we can do many of the things that we need on our own without their help. And so, the reaction to post-Reconstruction Jim Crow was that Blacks basically said, okay, not that we accept this, but if that's, we'll fight this, but in the meantime, we still need to take care of ourselves. And so, that movement towards taking care of yourself is deeply rooted in Black sort of political thought. I mean, so you can go back to the contrast between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So, Booker T. Washington, who was about a half generation older than Du Bois, and the founder of Tuskegee, taught that, okay, post-slavery, Blacks needed to learn how to take care of themselves economically, and to be able, we don't need to socialize with white folks. We need to take care of ourselves. We can interact with them, but the most important thing is to become economically independent. So he pushed for Black entrepreneurship in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So the National Black Business League came out of Booker T. Washington. That's something he created. So these early Black entrepreneurs looked to Booker T. Washington as sort of the model of, okay, this is what we got to do, is self-discipline. We're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to learn what we need to learn about whatever skills we need to learn to perform. But if it's a carpenter, you can become not just a carpenter, but you can have a business that sells carpentry services. If you are going to learn how to be a mechanic, you can do that, but you can also have a business that uses that skill in the form of a business. And so that's what he taught. That's what he told people to do, and they did it. And many of them did it well. He was, a lot of people kind of looking back think that, Du Bois was the bigger character. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was invited to the White House to meet with the president, which caused a stir. But that Booker T. Washington approach, you can tie directly to what happened in Tulsa and the Black Wall Street. Which was burned down in 1921. So that was really a manifestation of Booker T. Washington's Black independence, Black economic independence movement, and Black entrepreneurship. So that was a reminder when the Greenwood section of Tulsa was essentially burned. These were movie theaters, restaurants, hotels, dining establishments, personal service establishments. There were two Black guys in Tulsa that owned airplanes that used to take people around the area. So this was a thriving community where the whites' reaction to Black success here was violent. It was terroristic. And it was a reminder to many Blacks, entrepreneurship is dangerous. It could get you killed. And so, that's something that the, whites don't have to think about much. You might lose your shirt, you might lose your home, but you don't have to worry about anybody shooting you or your family. But that was not the case for Black Americans. And Tulsa wasn't alone. I mean, you had these enclaves of Black entrepreneurial success throughout the country because in many respects, these enclaves, these Black entrepreneurs were responding to a market opportunity that white business owners didn't want to deal with. So if you wanted to be buried in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, your only opportunity to get buried was to go to a Black mortician. So that was one of those early industries that Black entrepreneurs flocked to because you're going to have clients. Sooner or later, they're going to come. and so that was a source of great wealth. So one of the early Black millionaires in the early 20th century ran funeral homes. Same thing with insurance companies. Blacks had created these insurance companies because whites wouldn't sell them insurance. And so Blacks understood that there's risk and that there are ways to mitigate that risk, and insurance is a tool. And so you had what they called them policy men. And what they would do is that they were almost like number runners. They'd go door to door and collect your policy payment on a weekly basis in cash. And, what Black folks were concerned about in the late part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, was not being able to have a respectable funeral. It wasn't, we wanted insurance to leave our children $100,000. No, we just want to have a decent burial. So, that created all kinds of businesses. That created a business to make caskets. That created flower businesses that built up the churches, because if you went to the Black churches, even today, if you go to the Black churches, if they don't have air conditioning, they'll give you a fan. And I can guarantee you that fan has some mortuary on the back of it advertising their services. So I'm sorry, you got to stop me before we take out all of your time. So
interesting. No, it's so interesting. And I learned from Crystal Feimster at Yale, who's a historian here, about Ida B. Wells' work on lynching and how that was often connected to business success as well.
That's right.
From her journalism, Ida B. Wells pointed that out, or drew that up. So if we think about some of these procurement strategies to diversify corporate supply chains, can you think about that through the lens of this history? Are we now thinking about what had been a carefully maintained color line being crossed through federal policy aiming to incentivize interaction across that color line of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and that's also, historical understanding, and that one goes directly to Martin Luther King, who visited Chicago the year he was assassinated, and he met with corporate leaders in Chicago, and those corporate leaders asked Martin Luther King, well, what can we do? And at that meeting, he says, well, I know that there are some Black entrepreneurs who would love to sell your companies something. And so those corporate leaders, they felt obligated to do something. And what they did, here again, you have kind of like the George Floyd effect after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So those corporate leaders got together and they created the Chicago Minority Purchasing Council in 1968. And that council grew went on to become the National Minority Supplier Development Council in 1972. And that's the organization, I ran an affiliate of that council from 2001 to 2015. But that was a council, that was started by senior white executives at large public and privately held companies in Chicago that understood that Black and brown and Asian business owners were not in their supply chains. They just simply weren't in there. And so the issue was, well, how do we get them into our supply chains? What do we have to do? And so, that we have literally come a very long way from those late 60s, early days of the Chicago Minority Purchasing Council, when again, these Black suppliers just didn't exist for these large corporations. Now, it's not as good as it should be. And it's getting better, I think, pretty much on a yearly basis. But that that move to inclusiveness in supply chains is something that I never take for granted. It's something that requires work and commitment on both the part of corporations as well as the firms that the diverse firms that are trying to get into these corporate supply chains. They've got part of the responsibility as well to be excellent suppliers. And it's economists have this concept called an externality, and I think that's something that can harm or hurt or benefit diverse suppliers. What you have in supply chain is the easiest thing to do if you're in supply chain is to continue to use the company that you're using. The incumbency is hard to replace unless they just literally screw up, or unless there might be some completely brand new opportunity that nobody is an incumbent, then you might have a chance. And so not only were the suppliers to most corporate in most corporate America white, the decision makers in supply chain were mostly white buyers. And so, some of them didn't really have much of an interest, despite what their CEOs were saying in public. And so it's been a struggle, but, I think it's a struggle that we've seen some fairly significant success.
So talking about the National Minority Supplier Development Council, that's a national entity that sits over about 38. Are they regional or state level chapters?
They're regional councils, and many of them cross state borders. Some of them are within a state, so it's no real rhyme or reason except the ability of the organization stakeholders to get organized around a region. So the organization that I ran within the NMSDC was the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. But when I was hired as the president of the Connecticut Minority Supplier Development Council, but I was able to essentially take over the Boston-based New England Council to become the Greater New England Council, which included all 6 New England states. But quite frankly, most of our work was done in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut.
And what were the flavor of corporate clients that you were working with? And was it just corporate, or was it also public sector that you were engaging with?
We worked with both. I spent a good deal of time working with, and it's kind of hard to say how much was public, how much was private, but it was pretty balanced. There was a range of participation and commitment by the corporations. Some of that was due to the nature of the corporation, the industry that the corporation is in. And so what we found over the years was that corporations that were directly tied to consumers got the religion fast that America was changing, that Black and brown and Asian consumers and households had a lot of resources when looked at in total. You had these studies that were projecting, going back to the 90s, they were saying things like, well, if you combine all of the Black income in America, it's the same size as Portugal and Spain. And so we don't, if you're an American global multinational company, you don't ignore Spain. You put adequate resources into the Spanish market if you're selling directly to consumers. And so American consumer products companies, led by the automobile industry and the food companies, Procter & Gamble, and also the later on the pharmaceutical companies, began to pay a good deal of attention to supplier diversity because they saw it as consistent with their other goals of making inroads into these markets in ways that was sustainable and authentic and believable to consumers that were previously maybe ignored. And so those corporations, those consumer product corporations, they got it pretty early on. But I have to say, before the consumer product companies got it, the government suppliers, they got it first. And again, this has to do with sort of the history of supplier diversity. And so after you had the war on poverty, that was now picking up steam. You had Nixon come in 69 as president, and his presidency was largely the result. Again, I mentioned earlier, action and reaction. The Nixon success in getting the White House was a reactionary move, because it was a reaction to the riots of 68. The mantra of Nixon was law and order. The mantra, Nixon's announcement took place his announcement for president took place in the Deep South. I think it was someplace in Mississippi. And his message was, you guys used to be Democrats, but you're welcome to come over here. And we're not for all these voting right things and the civil rights stuff. We're going to take care of you, and we're going to, bring America back, make it great again. And so, but Nixon did something that hadn't been done before when it came to supplier diversity. He was, a capitalist, and he basically said, well, his analysis was, what's wrong with the Black community? And it was mostly a discussion back in the late 60s of what Black and white, and the Hispanic movement was bubbling up, mainly in California, but it was still kind of in the background. But Nixon was focused on what's going on in these Black communities. Why are they rioting? Why are they tearing up the streets? And he had some Black folks who were counseling him, and they said, if Black folks had businesses, they wouldn't tear them up. These aren't their businesses that they're tearing up. And so Nixon, during the Nixon era, there was the phrase Black capitalism was formed. And that created a lot of controversy in a lot of communities. What is Black capitalism, and how can Blacks be capitalists? But in any case, Nixon put into place some executive orders to require that the federal agencies utilize Black businesses. So there were a number of executive orders along those lines, and those executive orders also included policies to require that prime contractors of the federal government, mainly DoD contractors, also utilize Black and brown and women business owners in their supply chains. And in the early days, going back again, late 60s, early 70s, there was a whole apparatus that was created within the federal government to monitor the performance, not only of the agencies and departments, but to monitor the performance of the companies, the prime contractors who were supplying the Department of Defense. So the GEs, the UTCs, the Lockheed Martins, those companies now had to put in place what they called SBLOs, small business liaison officers, whose job it was to monitor their utilization of Black and brown and women-owned businesses. And they were kind of like ombudsmen within these corporations with a good deal of power, not that they could reverse a decision, but if these SBLOs could report it back to the federal government that the companies that had these large contracts weren't doing the amount of work that they were supposed to do, there were consequences for that. And so, those types of compliance concerns led to many of these large defense contractors and other federal contractors to put in place policies to more actively and aggressively and effectively try to utilize the minority and women-owned firms. And so you had this thing that was happening with large defense contractors being sort of incentivized to utilize the diverse firms. And then a little bit later, as the consumer products companies came in and said, this isn't something that we should do because somebody's telling us to do it. This is something that we should do because there's a market explanation for this. And if we do it right, we'll be better than our competitors. And so those things came and that came together. And that's why I think you had the success of the National Minority Supplier Development Council, so much so, and again, this shows you their history, the NMSDC's original funding came from the federal government. And so that's how they were initially funded. And it was because these large consumer products companies, the automobile makers, the food processors, and these other insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, they were all saying, wait a minute, the retail stores, the Macy's, the Pennies, the Sears, all of these companies were coming to the NMSDC and saying, we want to join, we want some help to do this better. And it got to the point where the NMSDC decided in the late 70s, we don't need the federal dollars anymore. We can survive without them. And that way we can do what our stakeholders think is most important. And so they cut the tie really with the federal government and then became a more traditional non-for-profit that relied on private support, in this case, private support from corporations.
We're used to thinking about globalization of the supply chain in terms of the fortunes of the workers from the auto industry. Mm-hmm. It never occurred to me until you were just speaking that there's probably implications for the suppliers as well. So do you find that to be true, that while there was a big sort of series of victories in moving suppliers into these supply chains, at the same time you have these other forces pushing those supply chains overseas?
Yeah, absolutely.
How are you thinking about rebuilding, or is there rebuilding constantly necessary as global capitalism unfolds?
Yeah, absolutely. Globalization had a huge impact on supplier diversity, and I think you're right. The tension was there to thwart the development and utilization of minority suppliers. I mean, it's one thing for a local supplier to become a supplier to a large corporation simply by the fact that they just happen to be next door or in that same community. But let's say you were some kind of manufacturer in or around Detroit, and so you could become a supplier to the automotive companies. But as globalization hit, then these minority suppliers not only were competing against non-minority suppliers, now they're competing against global suppliers who could offer the corporation something that neither the local minority supplier or the local non-minority supplier could offer, which was lower cost, and in some cases higher quality. And so that's a tough one. And so a lot of product started going offshore, and so you saw that, and that had an impact on diverse suppliers. There were some companies that saw that as well, that were dedicated and committed to and remain committed to this day to supplier diversity. They saw this globalization and they said, we've got to counter this globalization by helping minority suppliers do business where we are, wherever we are. And so I give credit to IBM and their supplier diversity leader, a guy by the name of Michael Robinson, who was in the Supplier Diversity Hall of Fame. One of the things that he did is he convinced IBM executives, he says, well, look, we're going to lose some of our supply chain to these global companies. And what we should do is we should take these Black and brown and Asian domestic suppliers with us. We're doing business around the world too. So let's bring them with us and show these folks that, these are some of our suppliers. We're going to keep them, and not only going to keep them, we're going to use them here. And so that was how many suppliers to the companies that got really engaged in this international initiative led by IBM to internationalize supplier diversity. And it was because of those efforts that NMSDCs got started in South Africa. They got started in Brazil. You see them in the UK. You see them in Australia. You see them in New Zealand. And ironically, you see them in China. But that was, that was, but globalization clearly was a threat to supplier diversity's development.
So do you mean that the US based supplier would extend themselves into these new geographies, or that the council would reform with a different subset of businesses in these new geographies?
Well, there were there were councils that developed in these other countries, often with the support of the NMSDC. Mm-hmm. and the NMSDC companies that were global in nature that were also doing business in those countries. Mm-hmm. And so these organizations, and I know these folks. So the folks that run the NMSDCs in the UK, and they're different in every location. So the UK's program is different from the Australian program. In the UK, there's a lot of emphasis on the Indian subcontinent population and on the West Indian population. In Australia, it's on the Aboriginal population. And also, so these are differences. You see in Brazil, there is a black sort of non-black dichotomy in Brazil that you see, and so that they had slavery long after we stopped in the United States, and so there are different sort of nuances in these organizations, but they're similar in nature. That there are some groups that lack economic power, lack economic access, lack political capital, and lack capital in general. You asked earlier, and I don't think I answered your question well, what are some of those things? And one of those things is capital, not just financial capital, but social capital that is a barrier to having success in these markets.
When you've seen these kind of supplier diversity programs work really well, mm-hmm. what are some of the key ingredients?
Well,
on either side, we can take each side separately.
No, I think if you look at the corporate side, the most important thing from my perspective is leadership. Leadership at the top of the organization, the board of directors and the chief executive officer. They have to be behind these programs, and if they're not visibly behind these programs, then they just don't get done well. And I was speaking I was invited to speak to a group last month. It's the New York Power Authority. They were having part of their Black History Month. They invited me to come and speak to their company, and I had developed a tool to help a company sort of objectively tell them where they are on a scale on their supplier diversity program, and so it's a series of questions that either yes or it's a no. So it's no maybes, no fluff. Either you do it or you don't. And so the CEO of the New York Power Authority was, we started talking, and this is part of kind of an interview meeting, and he was saying, well, tell me about this scale. Give me an example. I says, well, for one example that I have is, one question is, has the CEO attended a supplier diversity event in the last year? And he said, got that, check that box. So he was right. That's right. So this is important. You have to be seen at these types of things. in order to convey a message to the people that you work with, that you're supportive of this. And there are other questions about leadership that you have to show. I mean, you can't do this for nothing. And so, and that's again goes back to leadership. A lot of leaders want to have things done, but they don't want to pay for it. And if this is not something that you can start without an investment, it's like any other investment. You got to put some money into it before you can expect a return.
Have you found that you alluded to this in discussing the consumer-facing brands, but have you found there are different kinds of business cases that resonate? And could you give us a sense of the range of those?
Yeah, I think one, again, there's one clearly is on the consumer front. If you've got a growing group of consumers who are diverse in nature, then you're going to want to, I think you have a reason to include more diverse suppliers in your supply chain and use that information to support your work in these communities. You also have on the HR side, increasingly as Blacks and women ascend to board level positions in large corporations, they often are asking the question, we're doing fine here with minority consumers, and we may be doing fine here with bringing in more minorities in the mid management and upper management, but what are we doing on the supply chain? And so those questions get asked. Now the company, the CEO, the senior management, they have to respond, and so we see that. The other thing that I think is a driver, and this is primarily a public sector type of driver, has to do with, taxpayers are diverse. And so if you've got, a state that is, collecting a lot of money from taxpayers and then spending it, then people want to know, well, who are you spending it with? So I had a big fight when I was with the council with the Connecticut lottery. And, here's a case where you have a quasi public sector organization that had literally no business. They did less than $10,000 with Black women-owned business when I went to see them. And this was brought to my attention by a Hispanic marketing company in Hartford, that they are not doing much business with the Black and brown community in Connecticut. And, the company, the marketing company said, we've done all we can. We're just like pounding sand. They're not listening to us. And so they said, we're members of the council. Can you help us? And I said, well, let me see what I can do. So I called the president of the lottery, not the president, I called the commissioner that was in charge of the lottery. And I said, I'd like to talk to you. And I went up and he met with me and he said, okay, we're doing fine. We got all of the minority firms that we need. I said, well, that might be true from your perspective, but let me tell you what you're not doing. You're not doing any business with Black women-owned business. You got a difficult time. You're not doing any business with Hispanic marketing companies. And I mean, I said, well, isn't it who buys these lottery tickets? And he says, well, we've got a diverse group of consumers. I said, but you don't, is your consumer base as diverse as your supply chain? And he said, no, that's not how you run a business. I said, well, so you're not, so they told me, said, well, we're not going to do anything. We're fine. We're meeting all of our goals. And so I called the president of the lottery, who reported to the commissioner, and I said, we're not getting anywhere. And he says, well, we're meeting all our goals. We don't need to do anything else. In fact, we're over our goals. You guys need to go away. And I said, okay, is that your best and final answer? And they said, yeah, that's it. And so I went back to my Hispanic marketing firm. I said, let's put up a billboard. And I want the billboard to say, they want our money, but not our business. And I put that billboard up, right across from the state capitol in Hartford. I put it up in Bridgeport on I-95, and I put it up in Waterbury on I-84. And it was up one day, and I got a call from the governor. And he called me and said, Fred, you got to take that billboard down. And I said, why? He said, because it's not true. We are doing business. I said, well, you're not doing business. So we had a shouting match. I had a shouting match with the governor. And he said, you got to take that down. I said, Governor, I just paid for that billboard. I got 29 more days. I'm not taking it down. And so he said, well, I want you to come up here and meet with the president of the lottery in my office. And so I went up the next day and met with her, and she brought up 7 or 8 people. I just showed up by myself, and they yelled at me for about 10 minutes. And I said, well, look, is this true or not true? And they couldn't. I mean, the facts were the facts. And so that was a pretty, nothing was accomplished that meeting. We decided not to do anything. But the next week, I get a call from the president of the lottery, and she tells me, she says, well, we did some research on our use of firms. Her name was Ann Noble. She was the president of the Connecticut Lottery. And she says, I think you might have something to your argument. Can you come back up and talk to our board? And I said, sure. And so I presented to the board what the problem was, and to her credit, she said, let's address it. And so, and I said, they said, well, what do we have to do? I said, first of all, you need to have somebody that's responsible for doing business with these firms. If it's dispersed, then you're not going to get anywhere. So again, you talk about what the success look like. What do companies need to do? They need to have leadership. They need to have resources, and part of those resources are having people within the company who are advocates for these firms and can help move the needle. But that was a case of, consumers as well as taxpayers as a reason for doing something.
I'm just conscious of the time because I know we want to get the students in here, but let me ask you one more on that, and then one more final question. Okay. Thinking about the business side, what are some of the challenges for businesses to move into these opportunities once those markets are opened to them? What have we learned about that side of these kind of programs? Yeah, well, the businesses, it's still the business. Business is still business. And so the entrepreneurs also have to be led by good business leaders who see opportunities and understand that if they don't have the capacity right now to address those opportunities, if they're interested in addressing those opportunities, then they're going to have to do some things to make that happen. And so really the successful minority businesses, in my view, have been led by entrepreneurs. I mean, real entrepreneurs who know how to make adjustments, know how to make moves on their feet, to deal with the changing market conditions. And markets change dramatically. I mean, if you look at the early generation of minority firms in corporate supply chains, they were almost uniformly in things like janitorial. They did that. I mean, it was, again, going back to sort of the racial stereotypes of what Blacks and brown people can and should do or do well. It wasn't in, computer technology. It wasn't in corporate finance. It wasn't in law. It wasn't in any of those things until you started to see also Black and brown folks in America move into those types of jobs and careers and occupations, that they also began to move into businesses in that space. And so, the key on the supply side is that you got to have good leaders who can figure things out. I mean, so, nobody's giving anybody anything, including capital to run a business well. So you got to figure out how to get that capital and who to get it from. And not everybody is successful in doing that. But those who are successful are the real success stories, the real sort of shining stars in minority business development.
And no company shines brighter than Worldwide Technology out of St. Louis, Missouri, which is now maybe a $10 billion Black-owned firm run by a friend of mine, Dave Stewart. And Dave, built that company based on the early government programs that gave him an opportunity. They call those programs the 8A program. That were literally set-asides for minority firms. And so he was able, unlike a lot of firms who were in a very protected market, once they lost that protection, they failed. Dave understood business. He understood entrepreneurship. He understood that the temporary advantage that he had as an 8A firm was going to go away, and he was going to have to make it on his own in a brutal market that nobody's looking out for your welfare in that industry, but he was able to survive and thrive. So there are other examples like that, but he's probably one of the better ones.
Okay, my last big picture question is, if you could flash forward 20 years and imagine a world that you could wave a magic wand and set up in terms of what you would like to see in terms of an economy that supports and scales Black-owned businesses, what would that world look like? And what are 2 or 3 specific things we've done to get to that vision?
Well, I think it would look like, and I think we've seen hints of it, where Black and brown and Asian entrepreneurs are going into non-traditional businesses, and are using their connections and relationships inside and outside and across communities to build teams that make business sense, that are diverse themselves, that happen to have a leader that is a Black person or a brown person or an Asian or a woman. And so I think that the individual entrepreneurs who are able to harness that diversity combined with creativity and great intelligence, that's what you're going to see leading not just these entrepreneurial supply chain companies, but are going to be leading the large global institutions. And so I think that, it's no longer going to be a man from Central Casting that's going to be the CEO of some Global 500 company. You're not going to be able to tell who by the lineup of people in a room who's the boss here. And I think that's what it looks like. You're not going to be able to tell by a picture who is the boss.
And what are 2 things or 1 thing we've done to get to that vision?
Well, I think that on the economic and social front, we have to continue to invest more in communities. There are just, I am an optimist. I know from my own experience. I shouldn't be here doing what I'm doing. And I knew if people were making decisions based on, where I was born and where and who I was born to, that, there's no way that anybody would have figured that I would end up at Yale. It's just no way. So those things happen. And it's because, some of it is what I just call, dumb luck. But some of it is, you don't give up on people because of where they're from. And so to me, it says that's all the more reason to make investments in places where there's not a lot of investment taking place, in inner cities, on Indian reservations, in communities that have not had the luxuries that we take for granted in the circles of professionals and academics. There's just so much talent out there that we shouldn't give up on people. So I think that's the one thing that I would tell. We gotta, and what that means, we got to invest in communities. and not look at it as charity. This is investment. This is how the economy grows through that brilliance. I mean, you don't know where people are going to end up if you invest in them.
It's a wonderful place to end. And thank you so much for taking that meandering path with me about all the things you've learned over the years.